The child drew its first breath in a one-room hovel, mud walls, a dirt floor still damp from last night's rain, no candles, no celebration, just the muffled grunt of a mother too exhausted to scream anymore. And somewhere outside, beyond the rotting thatch, the church bell tolled, not for the birth, never for the birth. It tolled because the Lord demanded Mass, because the Lord demanded everything. This child was not born free. It was born owing labor, owing grain, owing days of its life it had not yet lived. The debt began before the cord was cut, before the tiny lungs filled with cold air, before the father even knew if it was a son or a daughter. None of that mattered. What mattered was the land. The land belonged to the Lord, and anyone born upon it belonged to him too. This was the life of the medieval serf, not a slave in chains, but not free either. Somewhere in between, somewhere darker, because a slave knew what he was. A serf was told he was blessed, told the suffering was holy, told obedience was salvation, and so he bent his back, and so he worked, and so he died exactly where he was born, in debt, always in debt. The feudal system was not built on swords alone. It was built on obligation, invisible chains wrapped tight around bloodlines and passed from father to son like a curse that could never be broken. A serf did not rent the land. He was bound to it, tied by birth, tied by law, tied by the church itself. And every single day of his short, brutal life, he paid for the right to exist. 3 days a week he worked the Lord's fields, sometimes more. During harvest, during planting, the Lord's crops came first, always first. His own small strip of land waited. His own children waited. Hunger waited. And when his labor was done for the Lord, only then could he drag himself home and tend to his own survival. But even that was taxed. A portion of his grain went to the Lord. A portion went to the church. What remained was never enough. It was designed that way. Plenty was not permitted. A serf who prospered might start to think, might start to question, might look up instead of down, and so the system bled him carefully, just enough to keep him alive, just enough to keep him useful. Not one crumb more. They called it the manorial system. They gave it structure and rules and Latin words to make it sound civilized. But it was extraction, pure and simple. The Lord extracted labor, the church extracted tithes, and the serf extracted turnips from frozen mud and prayed it would be enough to see his children through another winter. Marriage required permission. A serf could not wed without the Lord's consent. If he wanted to marry a woman from another manor, he paid a fine. They called it merchet, a fee for love, a tax on the only joy he might ever know. And if he died, another fee. The Harriet, his best animal, his best possession, to hand it over to the Lord before his body was even cold. The dead still owed. Imagine that. A man works 50 years in the same fields, breaks his body, buries children who starved in infancy, watches his wife age into a stranger, and when death finally grants him release, his family must pay for the privilege of his departure. The Lord took from the living. The Lord took from the dead. There was no escape. Some tried to run. A serf who fled to a town and survived 1 year and one day could claim freedom. The towns offered that promise. 1 year, 1 day. It sounded simple, but the roads were watched. The forests were dangerous. Bandits, wolves, starvation. And if the Lord's men caught a runaway serf, The punishment was savage: flogging, branding, mutilation, sometimes death. The message was clear: the debt could not be outrun, so most stayed. They stayed, and they worked, and they passed the debt to their children. To generation after generation, 100 years, 200, families lived and died on the same strips of land, never owning a single handful of the soil they turned. The manors were prisons without walls, the fields were cells, the lords were wardens dressed in silk, and above it all, the church watched. The priests told the serfs that their suffering was temporary, that the meek would inherit the earth, that obedience in this life meant paradise in the next. It was a beautiful lie, the necessary one, because without it, the serfs might have burned the manors to ash. Without it, they might have dragged the lords from their halls and strung them from the trees. The church kept them docile, kept them hoping, kept them paying, because the church took its share too. The tithe was mandatory, 1/10 of everything: grain, livestock, vegetables. Even if the harvest failed, even if the children were starving, God demanded his portion, or rather, the bishop demanded it in God's name. And the gold that flowed upward built cathedrals with soaring spires, while the serfs below shivered in hovels that leaked when it rained. There was no justice for them. The manorial court belonged to the Lord. He was judge and jury. If a serf complained, the Lord decided if the complaint had merit. If a serf accused another serf, the Lord decided the punishment. If a serf accused the Lord himself, that serf learned very quickly what happened to those who forgot their place. The nobility saw them as barely human, agricultural tools that happened to breathe. In legal documents, they were listed alongside livestock. In noble courts, they were mocked as crude and stupid. A lord could beat his serfs, could starve them, could work them until they collapsed in the furrows, and as long as he did not kill them outright, no law would intervene. They were his property, his burden, his profit. The children knew nothing else. They were put to work as soon as they could walk, gathering stones from the fields, chasing birds from the crops, hauling water from the well. By 10, they worked beside their parents. By 20, they had the bodies of the elderly. Bent spines, swollen joints, hands that could no longer straighten. The labor consumed them from the inside out, and when they died, their children took their place. The wheel kept turning. A disease swept through the villages with terrible regularity. Typhus, dysentery, smallpox. The hovels were breeding grounds for sickness. Families slept beside their animals for warmth. Sewage ran through the paths between homes. Clean water was a luxury most never knew. When plague arrived, it did not knock. It simply harvested. And the lords, safe in their stone manors on the hills, watched the smoke rise from the pyres below. But even plague could not free them after the Black Death. When half of Europe lay rotting, the surviving serfs dared to hope. Fewer workers meant more value. They demanded better conditions, higher wages, freedom, and for a brief, shining moment, it seemed possible. But the lords crushed the uprisings. The church condemned the rebels. Laws were passed to freeze wages and bind the serfs tighter than before. Hope was a dangerous thing. It had to be stamped out. The peasants' revolt of 1381 promised liberation. Tens of thousands marched on London. They burned records, killed tax collectors, demanded an end to serfdom, and when young King Richard II rode out to meet them, he promised everything they asked for: freedom, justice, equality, They believed him, they went home, and then the executions began. The promises were lies, the chains returned, the debt continued. Centuries passed before serfdom truly died in Western Europe. It faded slowly, reluctantly. The lords clung to their power until the very end. In some lands, they had survived into the modern age. Russian serfs were not freed until 1861. 1,000 years of bondage, 1,000 years of debt. And what of that child born in the hovel? It grew. It worked. It married with the Lord's permission and paid the fee. It watched its own children born into the same debt. It grew old before its time. It died in the same village where it was born, never having traveled more than a few miles in any direction. And when death came, the Harriet was paid. The best pig, the only pig. Handed over while the widow wept. The grave was unmarked. The church recorded the death in Latin. The Lord recorded the transfer of labor obligation to the next generation. And the fields waited for new hands, younger hands, hands that did not yet know they were already in debt, hands that would learn soon enough. This was medieval serfdom, not a chapter in a textbook, not an abstract system to be studied and forgotten. It was a life, millions of lives, entire generations born, broken, and buried beneath the weight of a debt they never chose. The lords have crumbled to dust, the manors have fallen to ruin, but the echoes remain in the soil, in the silence, in the unmarked graves that cover the countryside, like scars that never fully healed. They were born in debt, they lived in debt, and they were buried in it.